I'm not exactly sure where to start with this, but I guess I need to tell someone what's been going on. I'm Sam, a retired Navy officer, married to Alice for 16 years. We've had a strong, traditional marriage, or at least that's what I thought until recently. I'm the kind of guy who's seen a lot. Served in the Navy for over 30 years, faced tough situations, watched friends come and go. Through it all, Alice was my rock. She was there during the long deployments, always steady, always keeping things together. We got a nice routine now. Weekly dinners with the kids, the occasional family gathering, and evening walks where we just talk about anything and everything. Or at least we used to. A few weeks ago, I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. I was grabbing something out of Alice's handbag to toss in the car when I found a receipt for an expensive spa package, something I'd never seen her get before. Now, Alice isn't the spa type. She's always been low maintenance, happy with her regular routine, and never seemed interested in anything too fancy. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said it was a gift from a friend. That's when the first alarm bell went off. A friend? She hadn't mentioned anyone recently who'd gift her something like that. Not long after that, she started going out more. She'd say she was at a networking event or that she joined a women's group meeting on Saturday nights. That's when things felt odd. Alice has never been one to enjoy going out alone, and she's not even working anymore, so this whole networking excuse felt like a stretch. Maybe I sound paranoid, but when you're married this long, you get a sixth sense for when things aren't right. And my gut was screaming that something was off. But I'm a patient guy. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I figured maybe she was going through something, and I'd give her space to figure it out. Then it started getting worse. It's strange how easily you can dismiss things at first. You see little changes, feel a few nagging doubts, but you brush them off. After all, you've been married long enough that you trust each other, right? That's what I kept telling myself. But as the weeks went on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Alice started dressing in ways I'd never seen before. She'd always been practical, content with jeans and simple sweaters, but suddenly there were new clothes hanging in her closet. Fitted blouses, designer skirts, and heels she never would have worn a year ago. And it wasn't just the clothes. She'd leave the house with makeup that looked, well, a bit too polished, like she was trying to impress someone. She wore this bold red lipstick and perfume that lingered, something exotic that wasn't her usual soft scent. She said she'd gotten it on sale, but she was acting like she was wearing it for someone specific. Then, there were the things she stopped doing. Alice had always been the one pushing for family dinners. She'd spend hours cooking, setting the table, making sure everyone had a chance to catch up. It was a tradition she insisted on, even when the kids would make excuses or were too busy. But suddenly, she was the one making excuses. She'd tell me she had other plans or she was meeting up with some friends. When I asked which friends, she'd get vague, saying they were from her women's group or book club. I never knew her to have a book club before, but I chalked it up to her wanting a new hobby. I never thought I'd have an issue with her wanting her own time, but that's because there was always a sense of honesty between us. This felt different. She was keeping things from me, plain and simple. I tried bringing it up once, gently, to see if something was bothering her. I asked if she was feeling overwhelmed or just needed a change of pace. She shot me this look and told me she was fine, and that she was just focusing on her own things. And there it was again, that phrase, her own things. Alice and I had always shared everything, every triumph, every worry, every hard day. Now she was talking about her own things as if she had a separate life outside of us. The way she'd been acting around her phone was another red flag I tried to ignore. It wasn't something you'd catch unless you'd been together as long as we had, but it was obvious to me. She'd keep her phone on her, tucked away in her purse or pocket, never leaving it on the counter like she used to. When it did ring, she'd rush to grab it, muttering a quick, "Oh, just a friend," before she'd leave the room to answer. One night, I walked in on her typing furiously, her face lit by the screen, and as soon as I entered, she put the phone down, screen face down on the table. She gave me a weak smile, acting like nothing happened, but her fingers were still trembling. It was as if I'd walked in on her doing something she wasn't supposed to. That moment stuck with me. Alice had always been so open, so genuine with me. Now there was this wall between us, a shadow that kept creeping into our daily life. I kept hoping it was just a phase, Maybe a reaction to getting older, a desire for some adventure or new experiences. But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, something felt wrong. When I was younger, I learned to trust my gut. It never led me astray during my years in the Navy, and it's not something I can just turn off. And my gut was screaming at me now, whispering that something was very wrong with Alice. But I still didn't want to believe it. I figured maybe if I gave her space, maybe if I didn't push, she'd come around and open up to me. After all, we had always been partners through thick and thin. 16 years together wasn't something you just throw away. But it kept getting worse. She'd stay out later, go on day trips that didn't line up with any of the routines we used to share. And then, a week ago, she told me she was heading to a weekend retreat. A wellness retreat, she called it, saying it was to reconnect with herself. She assured me it was just her and the other women from her book club. I remember sitting there, nodding, pretending I was all right with it, but inside, I was numb. This wasn't Alice, not the Alice I knew. The Alice I knew would never disappear for a weekend without even suggesting I join or making some kind of family plan around it. This was the kind of thing she used to laugh at, people who needed to find themselves. Now she was one of them. I wanted to ask her questions, but I knew I'd only get more of her vague answers and those stiff, forced smiles that left me feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. So I stayed quiet, kept playing along and waited. I thought maybe if I watched long enough, I'd see the pattern, figure out what was happening. I even caught myself trying to talk myself out of it, reasoning that I was imagining things, that I was the one being paranoid. But the more I saw, the more I realized something serious was slipping through my fingers. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, nothing out of the ordinary. I was reading the paper, halfway through my second cup of coffee, when the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, and it just said police station. My heart skipped a beat, that instinctive reaction kicking in from years of being on high alert. I picked up, my mind racing with all the possibilities. Maybe one of the kids had a minor fender bender, or maybe it was just a wrong number. "Is this Sam Carter?" the voice asked, official but calm. "Yes, this is Sam," I replied, my hand tightening around the phone. "Mr. Carter, I'm calling regarding a minor incident involving your wife, Alice. She was involved in a small car accident on Route 5 near Cedar Grove. She's fine, no injuries, but we wanted to follow up in case there was any damage you'd want to report." I froze. Route 5? Cedar Grove? I had no idea where that was, and I couldn't remember Alice ever mentioning going there. In fact, I couldn't remember her ever having a reason to go out that way at all. It wasn't just the location. It was the fact that she hadn't said a word to me about any accident. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for letting me know. You're sure she's all right?" "Yes, sir. Just a minor collision, barely a scrape. But she did seem to leave in a bit of a hurry." I thanked the officer and hung up, but my mind was already spinning. I pulled up a map on my phone to look up Cedar Grove. It was a small town about an hour and a half away, on the opposite side of the city from where we lived. There was no logical reason for Alice to be anywhere near that place. I sat there for a while, trying to piece things together, but it just didn't add up. When Alice got home later that afternoon, she seemed calm enough, humming to herself as she put her purse down and headed to the kitchen. I walked over, and before I could even think twice, I asked her about it. "Hey, Alice," I said, keeping my tone casual. "I got a call from the police today. They mentioned you had a little fender bender." She paused for a split second, the faintest hitch in her movements, but she quickly covered it up, turning around with a surprised look on her face. "Oh, yes," she said, her voice a little too bright, too rehearsed. "It was nothing, really. Just a little bump while I was out running errands." "Errands?" I repeated. "Near Cedar Grove?" Her eyes shifted, just for a second, but long enough for me to notice. "Yeah, I was just out exploring a bit. Needed a change of scenery, you know?" "Alice, Cedar Grove is over an hour away. What kind of errands were you running all the way out there?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on her shirt. "I just wanted to clear my head, go for a drive. It helps sometimes. I didn't think it was that big of a deal." I could feel my patience wearing thin. It wasn't that I needed to know her every move, but we'd never kept things from each other like this. "Alice, if you just needed a break or wanted to go somewhere new, you could have told me. I would have understood. It's just odd that I had to find out from the police that you were in a completely different town." She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly. Sam, it was nothing. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. You're blowing this out of proportion. Blowing it out of proportion. That line hit me hard. I wasn't the one hiding things, wasn't the one sneaking around strange towns and lying about it. I took a deep breath, steadying myself because I could feel a storm building inside me, a mix of frustration and disappointment. I'd been patient, trying to give her space, trying not to assume the worst. But now I was starting to realize that maybe I was in deeper waters than I thought. Look, Alice, I said, my voice lower, quieter. If there's something you're not telling me, now would be the time to do it. Because I don't understand why a little drive to clear your head has to be kept from me. She looked away, her face carefully blank. Sam, there's nothing else. I just wanted some time to myself. Can't you trust me on that? Trust. Funny word that. 16 years together. And this was the first time I'd ever questioned her, ever felt that familiar foundation between us shift like it was built on sand. But in that moment, watching her dodge my questions with vague answers and strained smiles, I felt trust slipping away. I didn't want to admit it, didn't want to believe that Alice could be hiding something big enough to make her act this way, but there was no denying the unease growing inside me. I nodded slowly, deciding to let it go for now, though every instinct told me not to. All right, I said, my voice steady, but my mind anything but. If you say there's nothing, I'll leave it at that. She relaxed a bit, giving me a quick, almost relieved smile before heading off to start dinner. But I stayed where I was, watching her, feeling the weight of that conversation settle heavily in my chest. If Alice wasn't going to tell me the truth, then I'd have to find it myself. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts racing. Alice had drifted off beside me, her breathing steady, but my mind was still replaying the day's events. The evasiveness, the hesitation, the strange accident in a town over an hour away. None of it made sense, not with the Alice I'd known for 16 years. A part of me wanted to brush it off as coincidence, but that nagging feeling, the one I'd ignored for weeks, was clawing its way back, louder than ever. The next morning, after Alice left for one of her usual meetings, or whatever she was calling them these days, I decided to dig a little deeper. I started by checking her phone, something I never imagined I'd do. But I had no other options. My hands felt strange and shaky as I unlocked it. It was a violation, sure, but if there was something she was hiding, I needed to know. I opened her messages first, half expecting to find some explanation that would put me at ease. Nothing. Her recent texts were sparse, and the ones that were there looked innocent enough. Messages to friends, some group chats with her book club, reminders from our daughter. But then I noticed one odd thing. She deleted an entire string of messages from the day of the accident. There was a gap, and I could tell because the conversation with one of her friends had started abruptly, with no context. I could feel my heart sinking as I stared at that blank space. What had she erased? And why? With no answers there, I moved on to her email, checking for anything unusual. Again, nothing outright suspicious, but I noticed a couple of receipts for travel expenses, gas, food stops, and what looked like charges from places far outside of our usual routine. A coffee shop in Cedar Grove from 2 weeks ago. Another one on Route 5 from a month ago. My gut twisted as I realized she'd been to Cedar Grove before, probably more than once. It wasn't just one random drive. She'd been there before, regularly. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but seeing this steady pattern of trips to that town, where she supposedly had nothing going on, made my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, was waiting for her there, and she had gone out of her way to keep it hidden. Just when I thought I couldn't feel any worse, I spotted something else that stopped me cold. In her recently deleted emails, there was a receipt for a hotel. Not just any hotel, either, a cozy little bed and breakfast on the edge of Cedar Grove called the Maplewood Inn, a place we'd never been, and, based on the receipt, somewhere she'd checked into alone. I clicked on the receipt, staring at it, feeling like the ground had been yanked from under me. The date on the receipt matched one of her wellness retreats from a few weekends back. The retreat, she said, was with her book club friends. I sat down, hard, feeling a sickening wave of realization. She'd been lying. It wasn't just one drive to clear her head, not some innocent meeting with friends. She was spending weekends out there, checking into hotels, covering her tracks. And I hadn't had a clue. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the screen, feeling the weight of each new discovery. Part of me wanted to stop, to tell myself I'd seen enough. But I couldn't. It was like I'd opened Pandora's box, and now I couldn't close it. I needed to know the truth, every last bit of it. I pulled up her social media next, something I'd never paid much attention to before. Alice had always kept her profile simple, mostly pictures of family gatherings, the grandkids, our anniversary dinners. But there were a few recent posts, tagged from locations that were, once again, nowhere near home. She hadn't tagged anyone else, but a couple of the posts had vague captions. Finding myself, new paths, and on one of them, just a small heart emoji. No one would think twice about it. No one but me anyway. It didn't sound like Alice. Not my Alice. The worst part was knowing I couldn't confront her. Not yet. If I came at her with what I knew now, she'd just deny it. She'd say it was all innocent, maybe tell me I was overreacting or paranoid. She'd twist things until I was the one feeling guilty. No, I needed more, something undeniable. I needed her to admit to it. I spent the rest of the day with my thoughts tangled, trying to figure out my next move. Confronting her without proof was useless. But letting this go, pretending I didn't know what I'd just seen, that wasn't an option either. I decided to wait and watch, bide my time. She was bound to slip up again, and when she did, I'd be ready. The days that followed were surreal, to say the least. I felt like I was living a double life. On the outside, I was the same old Sam, keeping up appearances, pretending everything was just fine. But inside, every interaction with Alice felt hollow, like I was playing a role in some twisted play. I'd watch her come and go, wondering if today would be the day I'd finally confront her. But I knew I couldn't jump in without something concrete. I needed more. So, I waited, watching her like a stranger, studying her routines with a whole new lens. Every word, every gesture, every excuse felt like a tiny piece of a puzzle I was trying to put together. It felt strange, almost ridiculous, to be spying on my own wife, but I couldn't ignore what I'd found. I'd come too far down this road to turn back. Alice's behavior, as always, seemed perfectly normal on the surface. She'd go about her day, humming as she did the dishes, telling me little stories about her friends from her supposed book club. But now, each of her smiles felt like a mask. I'd look at her across the dinner table, wondering who she really was when she was out of my sight, in that distant town, at that bed and breakfast, or wherever else she went to do whatever she was doing. Then, a few days later, the next crack appeared. Alice announced, almost casually over breakfast, that she was going to visit a friend that weekend. She said it like it was nothing, just another outing, another excuse that I might have let slide before. But this time I was paying attention. A friend? I repeated, doing my best to keep my voice neutral. Who's this friend? She paused for a second, barely long enough to notice, but I caught it. Oh, you don't know her. It's someone from the wellness group. We just got close recently, and she's having a hard time, so I thought I'd spend some time with her. I nodded, forcing a smile. Well, that's nice of you. Her relief was visible. She gave me a quick smile, clearly pleased that I'd accepted her story. But inside, I was anything but convinced. I watched her pack a small bag that evening, taking more care than usual, carefully folding each outfit, double-checking her toiletries. She seemed almost excited. That was when I made my decision. I couldn't sit back and let her slip away to another one of her mysterious weekends without knowing the truth. If she was going to keep lying, then I'd find my answers myself. The next morning, I waited until she was ready to leave, pretending to be absorbed in a book on the couch. She came over to say goodbye, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. For a second, I thought I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, maybe, or hesitation, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I'll see you Sunday night, she said, her voice light, casual, as if she were just heading out to run an errand. Have a good time, I replied, managing a smile. The door closed, and I waited a few minutes to give her a head start. Then, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I wasn't sure what I'd find, or how far I'd have to go, but I knew I couldn't sit back any longer. I kept my distance, careful to stay a few cars behind. She drove down the familiar streets of our neighborhood, merging onto the highway without a glance back. My heart was pounding, hands gripping the wheel tighter than they'd ever gripped anything in years. I felt ridiculous, a grown man tailing his own wife, but I was in too deep to care about pride or appearances. We drove for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was closer to 40 minutes. Eventually, we veered off the highway onto a smaller road, passing the familiar signs for Cedar Grove. My stomach turned as we got closer to the town. She hadn't lied about the friend, it seemed. She was heading exactly where I'd suspected. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe on the outskirts of town, one I'd never been to. I parked a short distance away, out of sight, and watched as she stepped out of the car, glancing around. She walked up to the cafe entrance, and my breath caught as a man walked out to meet her. He looked to be in his early 40s, tall, with a relaxed confidence about him, and he greeted her with a familiarity that was unmistakable. They didn't kiss, but there was an ease between them, a comfort that spoke louder than words. She laughed at something he said, her hand lingering on his arm, and I felt a sharp, twisting ache in my chest. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I watched them disappear inside the cafe, side by side, her hand resting lightly on his back as they walked in. I sat there for a long time, my mind numb. Part of me had prepared for this, but seeing it was different. It was real. All the little suspicions, the secrets, the evasive answers, they all came crashing down into a single, undeniable truth. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to pull away. I drove back home in silence, my hands still shaking, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and despair. When I got home, I sat down in my chair and stared at the wall, trying to process everything I'd seen. There was no denying it now. Alice was cheating. She'd built an entire life outside of ours, a life that didn't include me. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. If she thought she could keep leading me on, lying to my face while she slipped away with some stranger, she had another thing coming. By the time the sun set that evening, I'd gone over every detail of what I'd seen, replaying it in my mind until I couldn't take it anymore. I was caught between heartbreak and fury, swinging from one to the other as I thought about her laughing with that man, touching his arm, acting like a woman who didn't have a husband waiting for her at home. But one thing became clear. I needed answers, and I needed them directly from her. If Alice thought she could keep lying to my face, I'd force her to come clean. No more evading, no more vague answers or wellness retreats. She was going to tell me everything. I thought about calling her, about confronting her right then and there, but I knew that wouldn't work. She'd be careful with her words, twist them to make me question myself. No, if I wanted her to slip up, I'd need her face to face. I wanted to see her expression when I brought up Cedar Grove, watch her reaction when I mentioned the man at the cafe. She'd never be able to hide the truth if I looked her in the eyes. The hardest part was waiting. She wasn't due back until Sunday night, which meant a whole day and a half of sitting with this knowledge, pretending everything was fine if she called. I thought I might go crazy, pacing the house, replaying the whole scene over and over in my mind. I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were full of images of Alice and that man, laughing together, sharing secrets I was no longer part of. Finally, Sunday evening came. I heard her car pull into the driveway just after dark, the familiar crunch of gravel under her tires. I sat in my chair by the window, heart pounding as she walked up to the door, her steps light and carefree. I could almost believe she'd come home from an innocent weekend if I hadn't known better. The door opened, and she walked in with a smile, carrying her overnight bag. She glanced around, surprised to see me sitting there in the dark. "Sam, you're just sitting here in the dark?" she said with a laugh, flicking on the light switch. "You scared me half to death." I didn't laugh. I didn't move. I just watched her, watched the smile fade from her face as she noticed my expression. "Sam, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice softer now, uncertain. I leaned forward, folding my hands, my gaze fixed on her. "Where were you, Alice?" Her smile faltered, and she blinked, surprised. "I told you. I was visiting a friend from the wellness group. We went to her place to, just relax and catch up." "Really?" I said, my tone calm, steady. And your friend lives in Cedar Grove, I assume? Her face froze just for a split second, but I caught it. She recovered quickly, though, letting out a small laugh. Well, yes, Cedar Grove. It's not too far, just a nice little place for a getaway. A getaway, I repeated, leaning back in my chair. Funny, because I happened to be in Cedar Grove myself this weekend. The color drained from her face, her hand still gripping her bag. Her eyes darted from me to the door, as if she were calculating an escape. "Oh, really?" she said, trying to keep her tone light, but I could see her faltering. What a coincidence. I didn't give her a chance to regain her footing. "I saw you, Alice. I saw you with him. At the cafe. The man you were laughing with, touching. He seemed pretty comfortable around you. Not exactly what you'd expect from someone who's just a friend." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She stared at me, her expression shifting from shock to something harder, colder. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight. "Sam, I don't know what you think you saw, but it wasn't what you're imagining." "What I think I saw," I said, my voice rising, unable to keep the anger out anymore. "Alice, I saw you with him. I saw the way you looked at him. I followed you all the way there, watched you go into that cafe together. Are you really going to stand here and lie to me?" She looked away, her hands gripping her bag, so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Sam, please, let's not make this into something it's not." "Then tell me what it is, Alice. Explain it to me. Explain why you've been sneaking off to Cedar Grove, why you're staying in hotels out there, why you've been lying to my face for God knows how long." She took a deep breath, finally setting her bag down. Her face had gone pale, but there was a glint in her eyes now, a hard edge that I hadn't seen before. She seemed to gather herself, like she was steeling herself for a fight. "All right, fine," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Yes, I've been going to Cedar Grove. And yes, there's someone there. But it's not what you think. I needed something different, Sam. I needed a change. It doesn't mean I don't care about you. I just needed something for myself." "Needed something for yourself?" I repeated, the words sounding hollow. "After 16 years of marriage, of being partners, of building this life together, that's all you have to say? That you needed something for yourself?" "Don't make this about you, Sam," she snapped, her tone icy. "This isn't just about us. It's about me, my needs, my life. I've given up a lot over the years, and maybe I needed a chance to explore things I missed out on." I stared at her, feeling the words sink in, each one like a fresh wound. The Alice I thought I knew would never have said something like that. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was like she'd become a different person entirely, someone I barely recognized. "So that's it?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. 16 years, and you're willing to throw it all away for what? A weekend getaway with some stranger. She didn't answer, just looked away, her face set in that hard, distant expression. It was clear she'd made up her mind, that she wasn't the Alice I knew anymore. The woman standing in front of me was someone else entirely, someone who was willing to tear our life apart for the sake of her own selfish wants. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but unyielding. "Sam, I didn't ask you to follow me, and I didn't ask for your permission. This is my life too." I stared at her, feeling the weight of those words settle heavily in the room. I realized then that whatever we'd had, whatever partnership or trust we'd built, it was gone. She had made her choice, and nothing I could say would change that. The confrontation was over, and with it, any last shred of the life we'd built together. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. The conversation we'd had left me feeling hollow, like some vital part of me had been gutted. 16 years of marriage, and she had thrown it away with hardly a second thought, hiding behind flimsy excuses and her own needs. I'd expected tears, maybe remorse, anything to show that this was hurting her too. Instead, she looked me in the eye, cold and defiant, as if I were the intruder in her life. Once she went upstairs, closing the door without so much as a glance back, I sat alone in the silence of our living room. I could feel the anger boiling beneath the surface, each new thought stoking the flames. All those weekends she'd spent in Cedar Grove, each lie she'd told me with a smile on her face. It felt like a slap to everything I'd believed in, every ounce of trust I'd given her over the years. I knew I couldn't let her just walk away from this. acting like none of it mattered. So, I decided to fight back. I wasn't interested in dramatic scenes or pointless arguments. I wanted something that would cut deep, that would make her understand the gravity of what she'd done, how she'd shattered everything we'd built. I wanted her to feel the consequences of her choices, to see just how much she'd sacrificed by betraying me. I started planning, running through ideas as I sat there in the quiet. I knew her well enough to know that certain things mattered to her. Her social standing, her friendships, the reputation she'd cultivated over the years. She cared about appearances, about being seen as the perfect wife, the doting mother, the dependable friend. It was all a facade now, but it was still the armor she wore. I decided that was where I'd start. First, there was her beloved book club. Alice had always prided herself on the friendships she'd built there, a group of women who admired her, who saw her as some kind of role model. I decided to make sure they knew exactly who she was beneath that polished surface. I wasn't going to shout it from the rooftops. No, I'd be subtle, calculated. An anonymous letter sent to a few choice members, detailing her extracurricular activities and the weekends away with her mystery man. A part of me wanted to reveal everything, but I knew that hinting at the truth would have them whispering and speculating more than any outright accusation would. Next, I turned my attention to her family. Alice had always been close to her sister, a woman I'd come to respect over the years. I decided that a quiet, casual phone call would do the trick, just enough to plant the seeds. I'd say something about our rough patch, hint at her trips out of town, and let her sister piece together the rest. Her family would know, and they'd judge her for it, no question. They'd start to see her in a new light, one that wasn't quite so pristine. And the next family gathering, whenever it happened, would have a different tone, a coldness, an unspoken shame she'd have to sit with. Then there was the matter of our finances. Alice had taken my loyalty for granted, never suspecting I'd be one to act in my own interests. But I wasn't going to let her walk away with half of everything we'd built. I spent the next few days quietly transferring our savings into a separate account, ensuring that when the time came for divorce proceedings, she wouldn't have a cent of what she hadn't rightfully earned. I consulted a lawyer, someone discreet, who assured me that if I played my cards right, the courts would be sympathetic to my case. I'd take our house, our savings, and leave her with the bare minimum, just enough to get by. But that wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel it, to know just how much she destroyed. I decided to make one last move, one that would drive the point home. Alice and I had a mutual friend, Mark, who was the kind of man people listened to, respected. He was well-connected, especially among her friends and the people she worked with in her volunteer circles. He knew everyone who mattered to her, all the people she wanted to impress. I invited him over under the guise of needing a friend to talk to, and after a few drinks, I let it slip. The trips to Cedar Grove, the strangers she'd been meeting, the fact that she'd torn our life apart without so much as an apology. Mark was horrified, of course, and I knew he wouldn't keep it to himself. By the end of that conversation, I was certain he'd make sure word spread. Her friends would talk, her name would come up in conversations, and those perfect, polished walls she'd built would start to crumble. When it was all said and done, I felt a strange sense of calm. I'd set things in motion, a slow and steady dismantling of the life she'd taken for granted. She thought she could betray me without consequence, but she was wrong. She was about to learn that actions have consequences, that betrayal doesn't come without a price. By the time she realized what was happening, it would be too late. The life she tried to hold together, the image she'd crafted so carefully, would be in ruins. And maybe, just maybe, she'd finally understand what she'd thrown away. The days that followed were a careful balancing act. I kept up appearances, maintaining the same routines with Alice, all the while knowing that the quiet unraveling of her life had already begun. Each move I'd set in motion was working quietly behind the scenes. Alice was blissfully unaware, going about her day as if nothing had changed. But I knew her world was shifting beneath her feet, and I only had to wait to watch it all fall apart. The first sign that my plan was taking effect came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, Alice's sister called me, her voice hesitant, heavy with confusion. "Sam, I don't want to intrude, but is everything okay with you and Alice?" Her voice cracked slightly, as if she were trying to reconcile the sister she knew with the rumors she'd begun to hear. I could tell she'd pieced together just enough to be suspicious, but hadn't wanted to believe it. "It's complicated," I told her, keeping my tone solemn but resolute. I didn't have to say much. Her silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, and I knew she'd confront Alice herself. By the time they spoke, Alice would be backed into a corner, with no excuse that would make sense. The sister she'd always leaned on would finally see her for what she'd become. But that was just the start. Over the next few weeks, Alice began noticing the shift. First, it was subtle. A friend too busy to meet her for lunch, another dodging her calls, and strained glances from people in our small circle. Her book club meetings were noticeably tense, with whispers and exchanged glances that she couldn't ignore. I knew she must have felt the weight of their judgment, the silent condemnation that followed her everywhere. Then, she received a message from Mark. He'd taken our conversation to heart, and as I expected, he hadn't kept quiet. He contacted a few close friends of Alice's, expressing concern over her recent behavior. The story had spread like wildfire. By the time she noticed, her reputation among her friends was tarnished beyond repair. That social world she'd cherished was now tainted with gossip, and every person she'd counted on had grown distant. Her calls were unanswered, her invitations declined, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. As she became more isolated, I watched her start to unravel. The confidence, the cold defiance she'd shown during our confrontation, it was gone. She was restless, anxious, her carefully built life starting to fall apart. I could almost feel a twinge of pity for her, but only almost. Once the social damage had settled in, I moved to the next phase, financial security. With help from my lawyer, I'd ensured that the majority of our savings, investments, and property would remain with me when the time came to file for divorce. Alice had never been one to check our finances closely. She'd always left that to me, trusting I'd handle it. Now, that oversight would cost her dearly. One evening, I broached the subject. She'd been pacing the kitchen, clearly troubled by her crumbling social circle, when I approached her. "Alice," I began, my voice calm, "I think it's time we discuss our finances." She turned to me, a hint of confusion and maybe panic flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean? Why now?" "I've been reviewing our accounts," I said simply, "and with things being as they are, it seems only fair to split everything formally." Her face blanched. "Split everything? Sam, what are you talking about? We don't need to do that. We're fine." I shook my head, keeping my tone firm. "No, Alice. You may have had your reasons for everything you've done, but I'm not willing to keep pretending anymore. I'm moving forward, with or without you." She tried to argue, to backtrack, but I remained resolute. I wasn't about to let her keep any more of my life than I'd already sacrificed. The next morning, I filed for divorce, ensuring every step protected what was mine. I wanted her to see, in black and white, that she'd lost everything she thought she could hold on to. Word of our separation spread quickly, thanks in part to Mark. But Alice wasn't the only one who received judgment from her friends. I made sure they heard my side, too. I spoke openly with a few close friends, painting a clear picture of what had happened, explaining the betrayal and deceit I'd uncovered. I told them about her weekends away, the lies, and the way she'd brushed me off with cold indifference. One by one, her friends took sides, and to my satisfaction, many of them stood with me. By the time Alice realized the full extent of the fallout, she was left with only a few who were still willing to stand by her. But even they, I could tell, were doing so reluctantly. She'd lost her reputation, her social connections, and her family support, all the things she'd valued more than our marriage. As the reality of her situation set in, Alice changed. She was no longer the confident, detached woman who'd looked me in the eye and told me she needed something for herself. Instead, she was contrite, desperate, scrambling to pick up the pieces. She started leaving notes around the house, small, pitiful attempts to win me back. She wrote about our memories, the good times we'd had, begging me to reconsider. She suggested we go to counseling, said she'd do whatever it took to make things right. But it was too little, too late. I ignored the notes, letting them pile up, each one a reminder of how far she'd fallen. She'd made her choice, and now she was facing the consequences. The last blow came at a family gathering. Our daughter invited us both, and despite everything, I agreed to go. I wanted Alice to see, firsthand, the family that was no longer hers. As soon as we walked in, I could feel the tension. Our kids knew, of course. They'd seen the divorce papers. They'd heard from me. They greeted me warmly, but Alice got a colder reception, a quiet judgment in the way they looked at her. Our grandchildren ran up to me, full of laughter and excitement. But when they looked at Alice, they hesitated, sensing the divide. It was as if they knew, on some level, that something had changed. She tried to join in, to act as if everything was fine, but there was no warmth in her interactions, no connection. She was an outsider, a stranger in the life she'd once shared with me. The divorce proceedings went smoothly on my end. I'd already secured everything I needed, and when the settlement was finalized, Alice was left with little more than a small monthly stipend, barely enough to keep her afloat. The house, our savings, and our investments were all mine, as they should have been. She looked defeated when the judge gave the final ruling, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But it passed quickly. She'd chosen this path, and now she had to walk it alone. After the divorce, I focused on rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy. 16 years is a long time to spend with someone, and despite everything, there were days when I missed the life we'd shared. But I reminded myself that the woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone who had no qualms about tearing everything apart for her own selfish desires. I threw myself into my hobbies, spent more time with family, and eventually found a sense of peace. The weight I'd been carrying for months had lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Looking back, I'm not sure I'd have done anything differently. The betrayal was devastating, but in the end, it revealed the truth about Alice, about the life we'd built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and she'd tossed it aside without a second thought. My revenge, if you can call it that, wasn't about hurting her. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and everything she tried to take away. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't control other people's actions, but you can control how you respond. I chose not to let her betrayal destroy me. I chose to rebuild, to move on, and to find peace on my own terms. For anyone reading this, I'd say the same. If someone betrays you, don't let them define you. Take back what's yours, rebuild, and remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well.